The corporations and the administration played a role in drafting the oil law. Can you highlight for us who they were and the roles that they played?
The oil law is the brainchild of the Bush administration, U.S. oil corporations. It's been 5 years in the making, and essentially it would simply take Iraq from a nationalized oil system, which is what Iraq currently has, what most of the world currently has, into a privatized model, where the vast majority of Iraq's oil would be open to foreign private corporate ownership. The Bush administration has been trying for 5 years to get this law passed. It's come very, very close to passage. The stumbling block is Iraq's parliament, which is resisting the law. So what we've had as of late is Vice President Cheney going to Iraq to pressure the Iraqis to pass the law. We've had U.S. oil corporations growing more and more public and adamant about their need for 30-year contracts. And we've had the surge, which the Bush administration, when President Bush launched the surge, he said the surge is going to work where previous U.S. military endeavors had not, because the surge is going to create the political space for the Iraqis to pass the benchmarks, one of which is the oil law. Right now, the oil law has passed the Iraqi cabinet, which is al-Maliki, the two vice presidents, the president, and the cabinet, have passed a version of the oil law. The resistance to the oil law is the Iraqi parliament, which refuses to take it up, which is opposed to the very idea of foreign corporations once again being allowed ownership and control and access to Iraq's oil. And they have essentially said that they will not take up the oil law. So you've got a very important loggerhead taking place between the Iraqi cabinet and the Iraqi parliament, with the cabinet serving the interests of the Bush administration, and I would argue the parliament serving the interests of the Iraqi public.
The resistance to the oil law from the parliamentarians, what are the key issues they are concerned about?
The Iraqi parliament is essentially representing the view of the majority of Iraqis, which is that they don't want foreign ownership of their oil. There also are regional disputes that are also playing out right now. Who does Kirkuk belong to, which is an enormous pool of oil? Who's going to get control of Basra, which is another enormous pool of oil? Is Iraq going to be split up into separate areas and essentially ethnic factions along oil control lines? There's disagreement, there's resistance to the oil law in the parliament over resistance to foreign ownership, over resistance to being forced to do anything this fundamental by the Bush administration, and to a deep concern among parliamentarians that the way the law is written will actually lead to breaking up Iraq among ethnic lines, which I don't think is the intention of the Bush administration, but I think it's more than willing to let Iraq break up under ethnic lines if that means ownership of the oil gets turned over. Iraq has 86 known oil fields. 17 are currently being developed. Those 17 would belong under the control of the Iraqi government under the law. People estimate that only about half of Iraq's oil is identified at this point, that Iraq probably has twice as much oil as we currently know about. So we know it has 116 billion barrels of oil. It's estimated that there's twice as much. All of that oil would be open to private companies using a model called production sharing agreements, which are the most generous, most corporate-friendly model of oil contracting in the world. The oil companies get, in this case, 30-year contracts. They get to control production decision-making. They essentially get ownership of the oil, not stated, but essentially ownership of the oil under the ground. They do not have to hire Iraqis. They do not have to partner with the Iraqi government or with Iraqi workers. They don't have to share technology. They don't have to invest any of their money in Iraq. They don't have to leave the oil in Iraq. Essentially, you would get the vast majority of Iraq's oil under foreign ownership and control with 30-year rights. Well, it's not unprecedented. There is a precedent. It's 30 years before, when the major oil companies of the world owned all of the world's oil, until the countries of the world fought back and took it back, and now essentially through an invasion and an occupation, the oil companies are poised to take back that oil. Essentially, the model that Iraq has today is the model that almost the entire world has. It's a nationalized oil system. Even in the United States, we don't have a fully privatized system. Any oil on state land, federal land, belongs to the people of the United States. And U.S. oil companies that operate on federal land are supposed to pay us royalties, or they can be denied access. This is what's happening in Alaska right now. We have public land, public oil, and companies are being denied access. It's the same offshore all across the United States. Oil companies would like to get in. We, the American public, say, no, you can't have that oil.
Which are similar to the oil laws in Mexico and Saudi Arabia
and almost everywhere on the planet. So what the oil companies are trying to get in Iraq is a massive transformation of the current model. What the parliament is essentially fighting to keep is what they have, is business as usual, and to continue running the oil industry as they have for the past 30 years.
The recent outburst of violence in Basra, what was that about?
It's about a lot of things, but Basra is also the seat of the majority of Iraq's oil, and Iraq's oil being exported at this point, and control of Basra is key to controlling the country. So what was playing out in Basra most fundamentally was a dispute between different Shia factions for control of the city. Control of the city is about more than just control of the city. It's about control of the oil, and it's about control of the heart of Iraq's future, which is who is going to own the oil. And when you're talking about the Bush administration, you are talking about a government that is the most interlinked to private oil, U.S. oil corporations of any government in the history of this country. It's the first time in U.S. history that the president and the vice president and the secretary of state are all former oil company executives. Their connection to these companies runs very deep. And for a company like Exxon or Chevron or Conoco or Marathon or BP or Shell for that matter, with very large U.S. affiliates, very important to this administration, they need to own oil. They need to book reserves. They need to control the production decisions. They need to bank the money from selling the oil. And Iraq has probably the largest oil reserves in the world, and it's oil that they want to own. The Bush administration has said there was an analysis that was done by the administration on the oil law, which said essentially that if the oil law passes and U.S. oil companies get to work, they will need to be underwritten by the U.S. government. And I take that to mean the U.S. military. Essentially, that the military will need to stay to ensure that the oil companies can get to work. That is a reason for the military to stay. Also, Iraq isn't the only oil in the Middle East. So the U.S. military being based and staying in Iraq is also, of course, a very important position for the U.S. military to be able to use to go into other countries.